So we're gonna get started. And I'm so excited about this panel because also this is part of International Education Week at UCLA. All this week we've been having events highlighting the amazing connections that UCLA has with people all over the world. So thank you for being here. And before we get started, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. The Center for Mexican Studies at UCLA acknowledges our presence on traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tonga people. And I would like to welcome our two panelists, Carrie Kahn, Mexico correspondent for National Public Radio, who's in Mexico City. I think, are you in Mexico City? Yes.
Yeah.
And welcome. And David Brooks, national correspondent of La Jornada newspaper in the United States. And he's usually based in New York City, but he is constantly traveling. Are you in New York City, David?
I am in New York.
Thank you. Welcome.
The only city to be in, yes.
Yeah.
I would argue that point.
No, I don't agree. In the US, in the US. I say.
We are in LA, Mexico City, and New York. So there's gonna be tough competition. So we'll see. We have beautiful weather here in LA. So thank you, Carrie and David, for joining us. And we wanna welcome also our students. And at the end, please remind me that, you know, our students are very interested in asking questions about how you become an international correspondent. What do you do? What do you study? How do you get a job like yours? So we're gonna make sure that we're gonna close with that question so you can share your wisdom with all of our students. But for today, for the next hour or so, we want you to also share your experiences and wisdom of watching Mexico in the historical election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador 3 years ago. And we were wondering how, since, and we're gonna start with you, Carrie, you cover Mexico for National Public Radio. You need to explain Mexico and Mexico's events to a US audience. And I wonder if you can let us know how you cover Andrés Manuel election and what has really struck your attention. What are the issues that you've been following up in the last 3 years? And then we'll continue with David. And David is based in New York, writing for a Mexican newspaper, La Jornada. And in a way, it's the other way around. David has to explain the United States for a Mexican audience, but also has to cover Mexico in the United States. So I think they have a very interesting section, La Jornada Sin Fronteras, in the newspaper, which covers that. So also, please, after Carrie, share your thoughts about this, what has caught your attention during this for 3 years of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So Carrie, the floor is yours, take it away.
Well, I actually wrote down some things because I know this can be a very polarizing discussion when bringing up López Obrador. I've found that with my own relatives here in Mexico, and I didn't want to extraneously say anything or not make my thoughts clear. So excuse my reading, but hopefully I can we can have a more fluid conversation after. And I tried to limit this just to a few issues. Just to start off, López Obrador's message has been really clear, concise, and simple. You know, from his time in politics, I believe he's combating the corrupt regimes that have ruled Mexico, and these regimes, propped up by a small and privileged minority, work at the expense of the vast majority of Mexicans. Those regimes survived and flourished with the help of many corrupt individuals, and top of his list is what he calls the morally bankrupt press, the fifi press, the conservative press, the neoliberal press, who are part of the mafia of power that has ruled and ruined Mexico. So also in that catchphrase of the press, he often adds think tanks, independent institutions, and university. And it's his disdain for he has disdain for more than just working journalists, but we do get the brunt of his wrath. And I think there are many who easily agree with that premise of his, especially here in Mexico. For far too long, Mexico's corrupt politicians were not working for the good of the people. I think many people agree on that point, but I would also add that López Obrador's concise, black and white, there are no shades of gray message does have dangerous consequences for journalists and independent institutions that do play a very important role in modern Mexico, providing some of the few checks and balances that are left in this country. And we could talk a lot about López Obrador's message and his skill, and I am in awe of his perseverance in delivering it. And he does that every day, every weekday in his morning press conferences. I attended many of them pre-pandemic, and I've yet to be able to ask a question though. I must not be good at this, you know, the waving and all that. But they last on average 1.5 hours, sometimes 2. Most of the audience is packed with reporters of very differing expertise and breadth. And so during the conferences, many of the questions are about local issues and what we call, you know, just soft lobs, not tough questions. And I would also argue that the style in which the press here asks questions can sometimes not be a question, but a long declarative statement. And also it's hard to determine what the question is. So by the time the reporter answers it, López Obrador is often returning repeatedly to his familiar themes, criticizing, attacking, and characterizing outlets that he finds critical to position. He'll call on reporters from outlets he doesn't agree with. He doesn't not call on them, but he'll always add a few zingers to reporters from especially Reforma and El Universal, which are major newspapers here. This confrontation at a morning press conference between López Obrador and a reporter from Proceso just has stuck with me. Just give you a taste of what the press faces here when you go to one of his press conferences. Proceso is a highly respected magazine here. And so López Obrador said to the reporter from Proceso in some retort, he said, he's upset with Proceso because it's not being nice to us, meaning his government. And the reporter then responded, and I remember watching this and I was just in awe of him being able to, you know, respond this way to the president of Mexico. But he said, President, it is not the role of the media to be nice to someone. And he explained the role of a journalist. And López Obrador said, all the best journalists throughout Mexico's history have taken sides. It's very easy to say I'm independent or journalism doesn't take sides instead of betting on transformation. Then it's just analyzing reality, criticizing reality, but never transforming it. So it's clear there are differing descriptions of the role of a journalist within Mexican society as from the point of view of López Obrador. And we can discuss what the traditional role of journalism is and whether journalists in Mexico have lived up to that tradition or not. That is a valuable exercise, but I have to agree with the Proceso reporter. And I'm a journalist because I don't want to be a PR agent. I don't want to be a propagandist or a lobbyist. I report on what is happening, and I take my role as holding the powerful accountable. And that's become a very difficult job in Mexico. And that didn't start, and it's not going to stop with López Obrador. That's an important point. Impunity in this country is rampant. When less than 2% of all crimes are solved, that is the fundamental problem. But Mexico is the most dangerous place in the world that is not engaged in a war. It's not in active combat to be a journalist. So since López Obrador has taken power, that has not changed. The Committee to Protect Journalists reports that 36 reporters in just 2021 have been killed, 36 in the last 11 months. And many of those cases have not been confirmed that the reporters were killed directly because of their job, but other national groups put those numbers even higher. Freddy Fernando Lopez was shot and killed this month outside his home in San Cristobal de las Casas, Chiapas. Gustavo Sanchez Cabrero was riding on a motorcycle in his town in Oaxaca with his 15-year-old son on the back. A car struck his bike, throwing them onto the road, and armed men got out and shot Sanchez 15 times. That was in June. The same week in June, Enrique Sanchez, a reporter in the state of Mexico, was shot dead. And in May, an online journalist, Benjamin Morales Hernandez, was abducted and killed in Sonora. And that's just a few examples of the journalists killed this year. Again, journalists didn't just start getting killed during Lopez Obrador's presidency, but advocates for freedom of the press and expression would say that the rhetoric of the president and repeated denigrating comments by the leader of this country do matter. I do hope that we have time to discuss that issue in more detail. I think it's important to put Lopez Obrador's relationship with the press in the context of the region. This is not a trend limited only to him, and we're seeing it in many countries in this region, and it's terrifying. And also talk more specifically about the Mexican context. Lopez Obrador spent many years in the opposition, struggling to get his story in the press, and that was in many ways firmly controlled by the ruling party. So there's that context too. And most importantly, the press in Mexico is a much different press, the independent journalists I'm talking about, than years past. They're much more professional and vital. I would argue some of the major corruption scandals, the same that Lopez Obrador rails against, were uncovered only by a vibrant, brave, and modern press.
Wow. Thank you, Carrie, for this summary. And I really appreciate that you put big issues on the table. And we'll definitely come back to the discourse of Andrés Manuel and also his relationship to the press. And also, I know you cover Central America and you can draw some comparisons there. So that'd be really interesting. Thank you for those opening remarks, and we'll come back to you. And now we're going to give David Brooks the floor. Go ahead, David. And you need to open your mic.
There I am.
Yes.
That was great, Carrie. And yes, let's return to some of those issues. Those are fundamental. And I just wanted to, as I was thinking about this seminar and what I would say, I have a bunch of different thoughts that come to mind, and then we can go into them specifically. One of them is how difficult it is to characterize this moment, both how to characterize AMLO in the United States and how to characterize what the changes are in the United States and Mexico. I think we're in unusual times for that. One of the things that comes to mind over the last 3 years is that looking at it from the United States and trying to cover it from the US, is that the response from the United States to Lopez Obrador's historic triumph, this is a massive historic event where there is a true fundamental change because of a civic insurrection, electoral insurrection in Mexico that gets rid of what was a monopoly, then a duopoly in power. It's equivalent to, the Republicans and the Democrats being thrown out of office, right? And so what's amazing about this is that it's amazing in itself, but it's even more astonishing that in the US it hasn't been registered as such. Things are like proceeding as if it's another president, and we're proceeding. Even more interesting is that the left, in broad terms, liberals, progressives, etc., haven't responded to what took place in Mexico. If you look at the main left media, whether it be The Nation or The Progressive or Democracy Now! Or the American Prospect, it's barely registered the change in Mexico. And if it is, it actually follows the mainstream press's characterization of it, and it's just an interesting thing. And furthermore, given that there is changes in the United States in terms of the political sphere that I'll get into in a little second, is that there are counterparts in the United States to we can, if we think broadly, it's a social democratic force that's taking place, expressed by things like Bernie Sanders in the United States and the movement behind Bernie Sanders. And in Mexico, it is a social democratic position in general. I mean, once you get down to the specifics, things are different. They aren't in touch with each other. They don't even recognize each other as potential counterparts. There is absolutely zero contact between the squad or between even some of the Latino progressive leaders in the Progressive Caucus in the United States do not recognize up till now that what happened in Mexico is actually maybe has something to do with that they could be potential allies or at least let's have a discussion. So what we have is that after about 30 years of intense discussions about how Mexico and the US and Canada are becoming a bloc and integrating, and there's an accelerated integration process and NAFTA and the issue of immigration, of course, as part of this, that for all this time, and now just over the last 4 years, the emergence of anti-neoliberal forces in both countries that actually have triumphed at the national level in both countries. There's all of a sudden this very strange desencuentro, no, or or no encuentro at all. And it just sort of notable to me, and also has to do with a criticism of what I guess of what we've been doing in the press in terms of explaining each other. Yesterday was this trilateral summit in Washington. The awfully baptized Tres Amigos meeting in DC, and the big news was that there was no news. Literally, it's if you look at all the mainstream U.S. media, the summit, this is a summit that's taking place for the first time in 5 years after the twilight zone that we went through with Trump, or whatever we want to call it, is that nobody judged this to be front page news at all, or was it at the top of any newscast that I saw in the United States. The New York Times summed it up as a summit where they made nice the three North American leaders, and it was correct. An editor, a colleague of a friend of mine who's an editor at one of the top US national TV networks, told me that the theme seemed to be for Biden that we are not Trump. It's like one more event of those. And what I'm raising here is that, again, it's despite all the rhetoric of how important the relationship is and the changes that have taken place in both countries, especially very recently, there seems to be no binational recognition of that. Just to finish up just with some of the things is, why are things different? And I think that you can argue that they are, and that so what we've been reporting in terms of, AMLO's triumph 3 years ago and Biden's triumph, or some people would say the most significant thing is Trump's defeat a year ago, marked, according to the explicit rhetoric of both in the Mexican leadership and the American leadership, the end of neoliberalism, of the neoliberal era in both countries. This is potentially massive. This is no little thing. And it's the end of the policies that have led to massive concentration of wealth in both countries, the privatization of whole sectors, the tearing apart of the social safety net over the last 4 decades, the attack against unions, and especially in the United States and in Mexico. These are all things that when you're saying this is the end of this, and let's remember, when we say it's the end of it, it's fundamental in terms of Mexico and the US specifically, along with Canada, because they were supposed to be the model for the neoliberal, for exporting the neoliberal model to the rest of the hemisphere. NAFTA was the example of bringing that together. It was actually called based on the Washington Consensus was the term. And this is we can go into what happened with that. Something that was first stopped by some of the emergence of movements in South America and electoral triumphs there. But then AMLO's win is sort of at the tail end of all that, rejection of that model. And so they're, on what this potential dramatic change, potentially, we'll see what happens in the United States, is and you can argue that Trump also marks the end of a neoliberal premise, and decides to go elsewhere with it. on it is important to point out, and certain experts in the United States look at Mexico and do see that there are some shifts under AMLO. I mean, it's not that everything is the same in terms of the relationship with the United States. There is a return, but that change is actually going back. It's sort of a nostalgia more to the 70s and 80s, and even before, of Mexico's, especially so in Mexico's foreign policy, pre-Carlos Salinas, you know, on the issues of non-intervention, self-determination. So AMLO's position on Cuba, for instance, rejecting the US embargo, the rescue of Evo Morales during the coup in Bolivia, the criticism of the OAS in promoting a parallel hemispheric entity, the CELAC, that does not include the United States and Canada, are what the Times calls policies that run counter to American interests are true, but this is nothing new. This is a return and a rescue, according to some, of Mexico's old traditional policies. So, and there's another shift that's also, when I first started covering US for La Jornada almost 3 decades ago, which is to say that I'm old, but I'm not wiser, that's for sure. I never imagined that in my reporting on the US, I would be using the F word ever, nor the S word. You know, I've had to report over the last 5 years about fascism in the United States and a neo-fascist thing. I never thought I'd have to use the word. I also never imagined that I would have to report on socialism in the United States either. And so for me, there's this shift of what's happening in the United States and a shift in Mexico. But back to my original point, there seems to be the perception of each other during AMLO's term is one that's still stuck in some kind of stereotype. Like there's a refusal to go beyond the usual view of the United States or to register what's changing in the US and vice versa. So I would say, just to conclude, that the perception of both countries seems to be so mired in the past that it's blinding folks, both at the top and also down below, about what's different. And what's different isn't necessarily determined by who's sitting in the presidential chairs in La Ciudad de Mexico or in Washington. It goes beyond that. So, you know, it seems to me that, you know, if we're going to understand these things, you have to go back to one of my, you know, what the great reporter Pete Hamill, who was a lover of Mexico as well, and you know, would say you can't understand Mexico or the United States only by looking at the cúpula, you know, and also was only reporting on corruption, violence, drugs, arms, etc. You also have to look at the culture and the history and its rebellions and the expressions of hopes and the defense of dignity that's taking place in both these countries. And suddenly, you know, you might just discover that we all know how to sing the blues or some form of the blues in both languages right now, but we also have to figure out, you know, I would say, how we remember to dance. It just depends we have to figure out what the music is in this near future. So I'll just leave it at. Those are just some broad thoughts.
Thank you, David. And we'll definitely go back to some of these thoughts that you're putting on the table and talking about trying to understand Mexico from the bottom up, Carrie. I wonder, in your reporting, it seems to me that Andres Manuel has been called a politician of the Teflon president, right? Because despite a lot of challenges Mexico is facing, what you mentioned, his discourse, how focused and disciplined he is. And on the one hand, of course, it can be polarizing, but he has a very strong following. And I wonder, in your conversations with those people, what have you learned? What has, from the bottom up, when you visit El Zócalo, when you're navigating the channels of Xochimilco, you know, that was a beautiful report. How, in talking to people, how do they perceive it? I mean, how do you think people, you know, Andres Manuel, it seems to me, has a proven formula for success. How can we explain that, or what is your take on that? covering how he's perceived by the average citizen. Has things changed for them, and why do they like Andres Manuel so much? Go ahead, and your mic, you need to open your mic.
That's a very huge question because it depends who you're talking to and what level of society you're talking to. In the Chinampa, there wasn't anybody really to talk about. We talked about history, but it depends where you go. And I would just to make it short, he has enviable popularity in this country. And then you saw when he was just in, he doesn't go outside of Mexico very often, but when he does, he gets a lot of followers, and he had a lot of crowds following him in DC and when he was in New York, and they're always supporters. But it depends where you go, and his support is strong. It's in the low 60s. At a halfway mark for a presidency, that's just amazing. And think about what has happened in those 3 years. A lot of it not in his control, but there was a pandemic where the economy contracted by 8%. More than 300,000 Mexicans died of COVID. He downplayed for a long time the virus itself and has not, I think worldwide, his economic stimulus was one of the lowest in the world, less than 1% of GDP. Just think about all these factors and his popularity, and it's a hard thing to reconcile. It does. And I would just say briefly that I think a lot of times the press we get stuck on the day-to-day reporting and the now and the moment and the pandemic and the economy and this and this, but I don't think we understand, and especially foreigners reporting on Mexico, how deep the frustration and the anger of living under so many decades of corruption that has a long shelf life. And I think we forget that a lot when we talk about López Obrador, and we simplify, or we don't take the longer picture. And this is a nation that, does not forget how all that corruption, and the corruption was in the last 6 years before López Obrador took power, went to new heights, and moral depravity that's so hard to report. When you have a governor of a state that opens businesses to sell chemotherapy drugs to children and puts water in those vials instead of the drugs and steals all that money, the depravity and the corruption is long and hard. And I think we forget that as the press. I think that's a self-critical point that I talk with my friends a lot, because it's like, oh my God, how can this guy be so popular? How can he have such high ratings and a pandemic and an economic downturn and no support for, businesses? How many businesses went bankrupt during the pandemic? How many people lost jobs? It's incredible. So there is something about him and his message, his perseverance, his focus that is quite remarkable. I guess I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Carrie. And as you mentioned, of course, it depends on where you talk to, and exactly. And I think just to follow up, I think, how about the opposition, the critics? Do you think they have found some lines? Fine lines that the political parties, some other, the people that he talks to during the morning press, right? He's looking for a fight every time he takes the microphone. You're shaking your head that the opposition. I mean, they have
the opposition's in shambles here in Mexico. There's no leading figure. The leading figure who I hate to even say he was the leading figure, is in hiding in New York and under investigation for bribery, and which he says is not true. And, we could go on about that, but no, there is no leading opposition. And there is no, the midterm elections just this last June, the Moreno party had stunning success. López Obrador's coattails lasted 3 years and got him 6 more, governorships, which are really where a lot of political power rests. And then there's going to be, I don't know the exact numbers, there's going to be 6 more governorships next year, and he's slated to win all of them. So and then, you know, I just have a hard time when you talk about explaining this momentous victory of the left in Mexico. I have a hard time describing ideologies in Mexico. Sorry, David, but they're all over the place. When you have some of these people that are in the Moreno party that were just pre-governors and pre-politicians, and then you have the pre-party here banding together to vote with López Obrador, and it drives me crazy. I have a hard time with ideological labels, so you can condemn me or not on that one, but so in short, the opposition here sucks. It's in shambles, it's not organized, and it votes with them when it favors them, and it's all about power. To me, the major ideology here is power. It's not left, right, and it's not center, and it's not on behalf of the people when you become a politician here.
That's a really interesting assessment. The politicians are there to stay in power because that's good business. Thank you, Carrie. How about you, David? The promise of the election of Andrés Manuel, as you mentioned, a historical election, huge numbers of people went to the polls. Andrés Manuel won on a big landslide with a new party, which is the other interesting thing. I mean, this is Morena, his party was founded specifically to nominate him for the election. And so the promise was there, right? For this to be a historical election with Andrés Manuel running as a candidate of the opposition. I mean, I don't know if you would characterize him as center left, and that's what usually the press characterizes him. So there was that promise, and then so on 2 things, on the politics of this, the promise of alternancia democrática, that would make us better. But on the other hand, I think, can you elaborate for you how you saw the election in terms of what you mentioned, the historical moment, and some people would call it political earthquake. Right. Pierre, I don't know if you can describe what happened in the aftermath politically, but also, and use what happens with that. You mentioned the recent meeting wasn't on the press, so the promise of a new era for U.S.-Mexico relations. What happened with that and all the issues that are under that, right? And which were absent for these meetings, because I think politics are supposed to have an impact, David. So, in Mexico, you know, what is your analysis of the political earthquake, and then what happens with the bilateral agenda with these new players? Go ahead.
You really like big, huge questions.
Sorry, I'm not a reporter.
No, it's good. No, it's good. It's just that you assume I'm much more intelligent than I am, so it's okay. I mean, I think it's what Carrie just finished saying, the nature of it, that profound revolt against the decades of corruption and a fury against the injustice and the abuse of power that we all grew up with. Anybody who was in Mexico was very clear. And so what happens is that that López Obrador is not a new player on the scene. You know, was his 3rd election attempt. He claims that the first 2 were, you know, he was deprived of triumph through fraud, and in Mexico you can never prove one way or the other. You know, our history is long and wide about that, and you know, you learn from the best, like Chicago and places like that, about how to do fraud. And so the revolt is fundamental. And I think what you know, there was this amazing gift that was given by the people of Mexico in this civic insurrection to this person and to his party. What they do with that gift is another question, but it's a kind of gift that you don't get very often in any country. some people, so you can sort of argue that that there's some parallel about that with Obama, right? And what the hope and the amount of people depositing their hopes on this figure, and Obama's a good case to look at in terms of what happens with disenchantment. And how is it that a Trump follows an Obama, right? And that has some echoes for some of the analysis of what might be happening in Mexico if certain promises aren't fulfilled. But what's interesting is what Carrie just said, 3 years later, they're still one of the most enviable approval ratings in the world, despite what we've all been through in the last 3 years. So, there's this momentous thing of that the Mexican people, through the electoral mechanism, have made clear that they want a fundamental change and that they trust this person to carry it out, because he is, one of the reasons that he still has that popularity despite everything is it's true. He is honest and he's not corrupt. Some of the people, but at the same time, he's surrounded by people that we all know, who you can't say that about, because they come from the PRI and other places. So it's a very complicated moment. But what I see when I'm back home in Mexico or when I'm with people who are his sympathizers here in the United States is that there's this extraordinary amount of wanting it to be true, and and the need for you to have some hope after so much has happened, especially in Mexico and as an immigrant and among immigrant communities as well. Are those changes for real? It's a really complicated question right now. I mean, because some of the policies that are being promoted don't have to do with a change. One of his first acts in office that had to do with the US was renewing the old NAFTA. And when NAFTA was first being negotiated, progressive forces in Mexico called it el candado neoliberal. It was the lock to lock down neoliberal policies. So how's the first act of an anti-neoliberal president to come? Not only that, but he came to visit Trump. The greatest persecutor of immigrants ever in the US's modern history, in the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades in terms of the rhetoric. We can go on to, there's a complicated thing to talk about when you start talking about numbers and speaking of Obama and things like that. But there's a complicated thing of why he came up and said that Trump respected Mexico and was a friend of Mexico and compared him to George Washington. What are we doing here? This is a progressive thing, that costs him, and it will cost him and a tremendous amount of potential support among immigrants in the Mexican part of the Mexican diaspora in the United States, as well as Latino leadership, as well as a lot of progressives here who, one of the reasons they don't trust him is because of this little dance he did with Trump, right? And we can get into the argument about that is he had no choice, right? And it's justified and stuff. So the new era of US-Mexico relations starts this way with a very old way of keeping the status quo. And then actually, a lot of the rhetoric that we just heard yesterday at the Trilateral Summit was rhetoric I've heard for 30 years, shared responsibility, cooperation for joint prosperity. We all respect each other. We're all equals. You're no longer the backyard. Yes, thank you for telling us that we're no longer the backyard. I've heard, it's like, sometimes you do get too old in this business because you just have heard too much and you go, what the, this isn't, there's no reset, or is there? And so, as I said before, there are certain shifts in that have changed from Carlos Salinas de Gortari when he decided that Mexico's solution was through the north, and following Porfirio Diaz's dictum that that's the only way to go, and that Mexico's future was in the hands of Washington or whatever, or lied in depositing everything in Washington. That shifted now, but how far has it shifted? I don't know. So the reset of the new era of relations is fundamentally going to have to deal with one subject, and it's a complicated subject, but it's one that I would like Gaspar to talk about as well. If I'm going back to being a journalist and being the one who asks the damn questions, is what the reset has to do with migration and the relationship with a new government with the immigrant community and the transnational communities in the United States. And for me, that's been probably the largest disappointment so far, in terms of just not because of anything wrong, just because of nothing right, I guess, or new in that. But anyway.
Thank you, David. Thank you both. And now I would like to encourage everybody to post your questions in the questions and answered section of the webinar. And why don't we read one of the questions that are there for Carrie and David? Cristina Chica writes, can either of you point to what exactly is leftist about Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador's policies, especially leftist as we understand issues in the 21st century moving forward towards emancipatory futures? As Carrie stated, he's a black and white in a very uniform and uninspiring way, and his popularity doesn't necessarily speak to structural change. Perhaps he's doing things that work in certain parts of the country and not others. I would appreciate any insights here. Talking about ideology, people are interested in characterizing him. Carrie, David, what do you think?
Well, I didn't say that he's uninformed and uninspiring. It doesn't. Sorry, Christina. I just want to point that out. I hope I didn't say that. But I would just quickly. I just would say I don't call him a leftist. I don't say that. I feel that, on social issues, he's very conservative. Women's issue, he has a terrible problem with feminist groups, especially young, angry women over the high rates of femicide and violence against women in this country. They criticize him as sounding many times as uninformed and as also not sympathetic to the plight of women and young women in this country. So he's got a problem. So I never call him a leftist. I call him a nationalist. I feel like his national policies are very geared toward what David was saying too, a return to the 70s and 80s when state structures dominated Mexico, especially when it comes to state large infrastructure, like the state energy company, Pemex. He would like to return to a lot of those glory days. But I wanted one thing. I just lost it. Wait, let me look back at the question. Where'd the question go? Oh well, but I would say that, and you could probably answer this better than I can, Gaspar, but in terms of labor, if you look at his policies of labor, and this to me sets up the contradiction of what Lopez Obrador is, because he passed these strong labor laws to democratize unions in Mexico and to give workers more powers before Trump called for the renegotiation of NAFTA. I mean, the USMCA. That was already part of his campaigning, and part of one of the first things he did when he was in office was to really reform some of the labor laws. He has constantly asked for a raise in the minimum wage, which is kind of a joke, but still I think it's very strong that the president of this country is demanding that people get higher wages. The wages in Mexico are abysmal for workers. It's embarrassing how bad they are. And he's also worked hard to stop outsourcing, which is a big problem in Mexico, and whether you agree with that or not, but I think those are leftist policies that I would say. But on the other hand, he had, in part of the labor negotiations that were had under the USMCA, Mexico must renegotiate all labor contracts in the country. That's crazy. That's like thousands of contracts. They all have to be held up for democratic elections, and that's a major statement by the government. And his labor secretary is amazing. She comes from a long line of labor activists. The problem is López Obrador also prides himself as an austere government. He believes in austere government, so he has cut the funding for all those labor courts, and correct me if I'm getting some of this wrong, but for the labor courts and for the government side that has to adjudicate and oversee and run these elections. So on one hand, he's saying this is the way it's going to be. We have to stand up for workers' rights, but he's not putting the money and the governmental structures that need to be put there to have that seen through. And we see that over and over again as he sort of shoots himself in the foot, excuse me, with his austere program of government. And one of the biggest ones is that the Mexico did not have enough of the structural expertise in place for FAA regulations, and the United States Federal Aviation Administration downgraded Mexico's safety records. And most of it wasn't because of the unsafe conditions here in the nation's airports. It was because of lack of technocrats and bureaucrats at work because of austerity cuts. And so what that has done is cost companies and cost workers a lot of money and expansion into the US, just as travel is coming back. So on one hand, he says one thing, but on the other hand, some of his policies hurt his own leftist, or what you would say, policies.
Thank you, Carrie. David, do you have any thoughts about what's leftist of Andrés Manuel López Obrador's policies?
Yeah, I mean, I think that somebody who explicitly rejects what was the Washington consensus. Again, it's another matter of what the actions are, but in his positioning of saying los pobres primero, and actually starting to propose development projects, education, rebuild the hospitals that were destroyed in the whole public sector health things during the over the last many years, decades, and of using that kind of effort and of elevating the issue of people not having to immigrate, by force, but by choice. All those issues are things that, and as well as wiping out corruption, transparency, austerity in terms of what usually is the business of politics in Mexico, and the politics of business, right? And also the mafia and el poder and all that, and rejecting that, I think are things that are not his. They're not, he didn't come up with those. Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas and other people had also raised some of those issues way back when, and he sort of came up from that kind of progressive side of the PRI, which is where Cárdenas and Porfirio Muñoz Ledo and all these other people had come up from. There's a long tradition of that in Mexico. It's not new, but it is part of what the dispute for the nation was way back in the 70s and 80s, especially after the crises of the 80s, and the technocrat and neoliberal win. And by neoliberalism, I'm just saying, in the very technical sense of the word, which is market-driven, free market, free trade as the mantra for economic prosperity and growth. And so to reject that was, regaining some of that, and also regaining things like historical consciousness. One of the things that Salinas de Gortari and his followers, Cedillo, et cetera, was their idea was to annul history, And it was a very explicit thing. It happened in the textbooks, the free textbooks that we all used to read. I mean, there was a dispute whether about the niños héroes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a real dispute about this. So López Obrador regains some of that and recaptures some of the essence of what are the progressive principles of Mexico, Juárez, Madero. You know, I don't agree with some of them, but as that they were that progressive. And he did get the support because of that. He did get the support of teachers. He did get the support of some environmentalist grassroots, of women, of students, of youth that did go out to that, to support him in that. What happened with that, and what's interesting, is that he's losing that support now because of what Carrie's saying, you know, of some of his positions on women or on the teachers, especially the Democratic teachers movement that were one of the vanguards to make it possible for him to win, are now disputing whether he's that comprometido with some of these same principles. And I think that's the debate that's taking place. And in Mexico, the environmental issue is one that needs a whole forum all on its own. Is why is the progressive government investing in refineries during COP, and you know, while environmental grassroots leaders are in Glasgow saying that that's the end of the world, you know, and any government that's doing that is destroying the future of all children, and the scientists agree with that. So all of a sudden, you know, it's a complicated one. But I would say that you know, La Jornada was founded on some of the same aspirations and democratic principles as part of a fight to democratize the media in Mexico. You know, the intellectuals, the artists that were behind that is what we're doing that. And so it was sort of like part of what happened 3 years ago. It was like, oh, you know, for many of us, it was, wow, you know, it seems like we won, entre comillas, right? And now you have to think, well, what did we win and what was won is a major question, especially since a lot of those sectors, the artists, the women, that had, you know, the voiceless are now having a questioning the quality of the progressiveness, I guess, is the word, or something like that. And some of it comes with blood, you know, and as Carrie started saying about what happens with journalists in Mexico. You know, and all of us have colleagues who are part of that list, right? And so, and the fact that a progressive government still continues to demonize journalists is kind of outrageous, right? And so I mean, I think it's a dispute as to what the future of progressive, what it means to be progressive, but it's not so dissimilar as to the discussion in the US, I would argue, either.
Thank you. There are a couple questions about AMLO's relationship to the press. So I wonder, let's pose that on the table to continue this issue. One, Ruben writes, maybe used to put it in a sort of a question. What would you think about that? One explanation of AMLO's popularity is that he has 2-hour daily nationally televised platforms that he has essentially, where he has essentially a monopoly to deliver his message. So that's one thing. And the other question was, okay. So is that his ability to have is that a fundamental shift? Is that a fundamental shift in how a president conducts business, for example, to have those daily things? And how has that transformed the relationship to the press, to have such a presence every day? I mean, and is that unusual, Carrie? In other, as you compare AMLOs, maybe only to maybe an ex-president here in the North, right, with his massive presence. I don't know. What do you think? Is that his monopoly? Is that what explains his popularity?
Well, it doesn't explain it all, but he sets the news agenda, and he's up. I'm in awe of his stamina. This man, how old is he? 68 years old. I'm not 68, but I'm not that much younger than him. But I tried to go to the mañaneras every day for like 2 weeks, and I pooped out. Well, I had to get there a lot earlier, but he gets there a lot earlier too. He has a meeting before it. So it's just his stamina is quite incredible, but he sets the news agenda. When you're in your morning drive, they're either broadcasting it or pieces of the Mañanera, and then the newspapers are following him right after. And he'll say something, and then whatever you had planned, it's like Trump too. Trump would say something, whatever it was, and then all the news would shift toward that. So AMLO he uses it brilliantly. And on the weekends, he is out in the countryside overseeing his projects or whatever he went to go look at. And he is, holding hands with the people and talking. After the pandemic, he wasn't during the pandemic, he got criticized a lot for that, but this man never stops working. So that is, he dominates the news agenda. But I just want, Ruben had another question that I think is interesting, and where he's saying, like, by saying that, characterization of Mexico before AMLO was that it was corrupt, are we buying into his rhetoric? I think that we cannot underestimate, or we cannot understate how corrupt the system was as it gotten. And you talk about these gains in the 70s, true, proportional representation in Congress. You could look at that and say that it is more than half of the Congress is doled out to parties and is not held accountable by the voters of the people. And if you look at who is in charge of the major committees within Congress, most of those people are ones that were doled out by I can't even talk. Proportional representation. So there have the INE, some say, has grown too wild and too extravagant, but Lopez Obrador and his plans for austerity is now attacking INE and trying to cut, and has cut, its budget. If you look at the budget proposed for 2022, it's quite striking how much will be cut from the INE budget. So, I don't think we're buying into the rhetoric. I think the rhetoric always is based in some sort of truth, but I think you have to look at, it's a more complicated picture. But he dominates the news cycle, and he is a master of it.
Okay. Thank you. And let's go to these last two questions, because I want to move more to the future, the next 3 years. So Stephen Tobin writes, given the decades of profound corruption that preceded Andrés Manuel López Obrador that you have been speaking of, how do you assess how he has concretely addressed this widespread issue of corruption since he had been in office? What action has he taken to reduce its prevalence? Any thoughts on that? His fight on corruption, have things changed? Do you have any thought? David, Carrie?
Well, on corruption, you don't want to take this, Carrie?
Well, I feel like when he continues he talks the talk, but you can point to many examples where his crackdown on corruption has not lived up to the rhetoric. And I think some of the biggest examples would be on his fight to stop huachicoleo and like the stealing of gas from the pipelines throughout the country. And so what does he do? He said, this is a terrible problem. He pointed to the whole problem and told us all about it. And then he closed the pipelines. So then the middle of the country was without gasoline. And a country without gasoline just comes to a standstill. This was pre-pandemic. And so we've seen in other times when he's tried to stop corruption. And then what he had to do is he had to send gasoline tanker trucks all around the country, and then send the army with them or the National Guard with them to protect these as he sent gas all around to these places that were cut off because he had shut down the pipelines. If you look at the numbers of gas stolen, they've only gone up. There was a time when they were flat, but they have once again returned. The practice has not stopped. And the organized crime around that practice has not stopped. And so that's one example. Also with, there's a lot of problem with drugs, not illegal drugs, pharmaceuticals. in health centers throughout the country. It was a corrupt system. It was a terrible system, and it was a monopolistic system. And he said, this has got to end. We have to have a better way of running this. So he shut down all of the, he seems to react very, very forcefully. But what it did was that there were many of the hospitals throughout the country still have not recovered and don't have a clean, transparent, and a fluid supply of pharmaceuticals in the country. So you could point to a lot of examples of that. I do think that hearing that the leader of the country will not permit corruption is helpful, but the checks and balances in this country are weak. And one of the checks and balances, the institutions are weak and the independent institutions are few. And his fight against those independent institutions, I believe, are not the place to fight the corruption. And I think that independent institutions, think tanks, and brave journalists in this country have brought a lot of light to the corruption in this country and could be partners of his instead of enemies. But this is, and we also talked about putting this in the context of what's happening. Democracy, electoral democracy in Latin America, especially in this region here in Central America and the Caribbean, is under great threat right now. And I feel like if you put this into the context of what is going on in the region, it's troublesome and it is concerning. There is a lot of laws that are being passed now to characterize and to have journalists and independent media outlets register as foreign agents. And that is will become the law in El Salvador. Nicaragua has stiff penalties for any journalists that take money from foundations outside of the country. We see that in Cuba, and we see that, of course, in Venezuela, and we see that in Guatemala. And within the Morena party, there are proposals, there was just one last week, to register as foreign agents independent media organizations that receive money. And I find that very troubling in the context of democracy, and it's not working so well here in this part of the country. And it's not being supported or encouraged by the citizenship. It's not working. So electoral democracy. So these are troubling times. And I think, undermining institutions, through rhetoric, undermining institutions budgetarily, and is a troubling sign in Mexico.
Thank you for that sovereign analysis. Cindy Fan joined late, and so she's asking if you can comment about the meeting of Biden, Andres Manuel, and Trudeau. If you can summarize that, David, being in the East Coast, what would you say? Why didn't make the front page news? I mean, such an important event, a trilateral meeting of these three presidents in the middle of the pandemic. What happened?
It's a good question. We don't know. Literally, we don't know why they had this meeting. I've been asking all kinds of people on the Mexican side, on the American side. It interrupts Infrastructure Week. It interrupts the launching of Building Back Better. These are the top priorities of this administration. Why they needed this in the middle is unclear. And what was the benefit of it for anybody besides saying we all get along? We're back. This is repairing all the damage from the Trump years, and here we are all together pledging to work together. There was no major deal announced. The only deal announced was that they would work very hard for the next year before they meet again in Mexico City. Mexico will be hosting the next trilateral summit, and they discussed the main issues that are involved. It's fighting the pandemic, advancing competitiveness, equitable growth, all those words that they use. They committed to climate change, and but they didn't establish any real targets. They were supposed to, but they didn't make it into the final declaration. And I don't know whose fault was that. And they decided to avoid all the key, really difficult issues about migration and just talk about a vision for regional handling of management of migration. And we'll talk about that some other day. And there was some interesting things of protecting labor rights and some of the bilateral work and promoting democracy in the hemisphere. And they talked about the Summit of the Americas that's coming up and another democracy summit that Biden is talking about. And that, they all agreed that democracy should be the hallmark of our hemisphere. So it was those kind of massive agreements, major earth-shattering agreements that were reached. And so there was a real struggle by the spokespeople on all sides. Marcelo Ebrard, the Mexican foreign minister's final press conference was, there was nothing he could point to that was, the deliverables were a list of tasks that were going to be taken. So I don't know if somebody desperately needed the photo op, or what. And it's one of usually these summits you can, if somebody, the work of spokespeople and public relations people are to summarize something like that in three, to say three things about it that you're supposed to remember. Nobody's going to remember what the three things here were. I mean, we don't, it's like, yes, there's lots of problems. We're going to deal with them collectively, cooperatively, and respecting each other profoundly. And so that's what happened. I mean, one of the other things that I want to go back to about this trilateral meeting and really the bilateral meeting is linking into what Carrie was just saying about the fragile nature of some of the democratic structures and processes in Mexico are also accompanied by unprecedented, exactly the same can be said about the US. I mean, this country is investigating what happened during what most people consider a coup or an attempted coup, the 6th of January. There is hundreds of democracy experts that keep on putting out declarations saying that democracy is a threat in the United States like never before, and it's in jeopardy. And there's lots of discussion about political violence that may be in the future, that's happening now and in the future, and that the major national security threat to the United States is, white supremacist right-wing groups. And so it would be interesting to have a bilateral conversation about mutual threats to democracy in both countries at some point. It's one of the things that I think is important is that in Mexico, in López Obrador's, at least in defense of some of the people that are with him, is that they do believe that what was left were decades of mierda. I mean, that they're finding that the rot is so profound that it's even worse than they expected. So if you talk to Paco Taibo, even in a little place like the Fondo de Cultura Económica, he'll describe to you how the director of that had a special wine cellar just for him and his guests at the bottom, and that this is a book publishing place. I mean, what is this at the, and to the massive things that there are attempts to shift that, and that by at the same time you're touching upon very powerful interests once you proceed, on this issue. But that the one thing that needs to be understood about how you strengthen the democracy thing is that in Mexico, at least, and I think this is a very difficult conversation in terms of the NGOs and media in Mexico. It's because of some of how many of these organizations were attached and did benefit, not all of them, but enough of them, to the past corruption or to the private sector in Mexico or to foreign foundations, that there is this nationalist reaction where all of a sudden everybody's in the same basket, whether you're a human rights group or you're a journalist, there's no distinction made, which is unfortunate. But it does come from some reality of, the CIA is active in Mexico and has been active in Mexico through some of these groups. So we have the history of that. So if you come up with those people then everybody's suspect, when it's absurd that everybody's suspect. I mean, you got to make the distinctions, especially you can't decide that the people who are suspect are only the ones that criticize you. That's you're all of a sudden you're accused of it because you're critical, right? And so it becomes a very complicated thing. And just to go about the mañaneras just quickly, it used to be a reward in my newspaper to be assigned to presidencia. And as it was in every newspaper, and now it feels like a punishment exactly because of Carrie. It's like you're being punished because you have to get there at 4 a.m. if you hope to get a seat. Yeah.
Thank you, David. So let's start wrapping it up. Go ahead, Carrie.
I just quickly would counter to that just the adage, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I do believe that the corruption in those institutions and the way the funding of journalists before was incredibly corrupt. But to put those in the hands of the state now and all that non-discretionary fund in the hands of the state is what happens when Lopez, if you believe that he is honest and not corrupt, what happens when he leaves? I just believe it's through institution building and making those institutions stronger and more transparent than rather to throw them all to the state.
Absolutely.
And would also say my colleagues during the Trump administration would always say, democracy is under threat. This is we can't get our calls back. We don't hear we can't get information. This is I said, welcome to my world. I worked in Latin America for 20 years. But I think that one thing that the Trump administration, you could talk about ideologies and all, and the threat of supremacy is that the institutions are strong in the US. The institutions here in Latin America are very weak and they're troubling and they're getting weaker, and democracy is under threat and has been under threat here.
Yeah, but you have to say that you can have an election in Mexico where the opposition won and there wasn't a coup right after.
Well, you could say that was thought too.
No, but I mean, it's amazing that I'm having to cover this here. It really is.
Yeah,
I agree that it's not who's better or who's worse. It's just I mean, of all things, to have to cover what happened in this country is, I just had to write about some guy with horns getting indicted.
I could top that. I had to sit through an hour-and-a-half speech by Daniel Ortega. What happened and what the U.S. is doing in the congressional, oversight committee hearings over January 6th is the same thing he is doing.
Absolutely.
Stop the terrorists that are trying to overthrow him in a coup. So I think we're on.
Yeah.
Okay. So why don't we wrap it up? And I want you to address 2 questions in one because we're running out of time. And so as a journalist where you are, what are the issues that you're going to be paying attention in the next 3 years following Andrés Manuel López Obrador? What are your interests? And also, this is International Education Week at UCLA. How do you become an international journalist, a foreign correspondent? Can you share a little bit about that? So let's get us going, Carrie. The future, what are the issues that you're following up? And how do you become an international correspondent? Go ahead.
I'll try and be concise as possible. I think exactly the issues that we've talked about and exactly what David started us off with, I think, is explaining López Obrador to an American audience. I feel like, I don't know if I failed or he's just too complex or what. It's a difficult task and I will continue to strive to do that. I cover 14 countries, so this isn't the only country I cover. So I just see an assault on democracy and democratic issues in the region that are troubling. And so I'll be in Honduras next week covering that election. And so Anyway, and the situation in Haiti is so distressful, and the situation in Cuba, I'm sorry, is over romanticized by the left, including the Mexican left, and it's troubling and disturbing. And Mexico abstaining from a vote to declare what happened in Nicaragua as a fraud and as a sham and a farce is just upsetting beyond belief. Anyway, so I'll be looking at all those issues. How did I become a foreign correspondent? Crazy, long, convoluted way. My degree is in biochemistry. I wanted to be a veterinarian, and I spent many years working in research labs. And anyway, I couldn't ever really get a good enough score on the MCAT, so I kind of abandoned that course. I've had many careers in my life, but this is the most rewarding. It's frustrating. It's been frustrating to report on just the sad things that I report on. I really do think my next move will be a comedy TV script writer, because that's what I would really like to do. But I just started listening to NPR. I was lucky. I lived in a small town, is where I met Gaspar, and they had a wonderful open public radio station, and they had an internship, and I said, I want to do that. I can do that. It was a long learning process. I didn't go to J school. I didn't have a lot of student debt, and I kind of moved around and could be poor and freelance, and where I worked hard. I will say I did work hard, and this was always my dream job, to be the correspondent in Mexico. And after 15 years and 3 tries, they gave me the job.
Right on, Carrie. Congratulations. And you've been doing a great job. How about you, David? What are you being looking in the future, and how can you become an international correspondent?
I think in the future, what we'll be looking at is we're going to go back to how we started. The proposal for the U.S. Bureau for La Jornada was different from other places. When I first started doing that, which was the idea is, who the hell are we integrating ourselves with? Who is the gringo? Is there just one kind, or what? And so it's busting the stereotypes, the same thing that everybody, any foreign correspondent has to try to do. But going back to that, because the stereotypes have come back, and it's one of the great frustrations is that despite huge efforts by just many of us to sort of demystify and try to change the perception of what the US is as a much more complex thing, and understanding its social and economic and cultural dynamics, and not just focus on what happens in Washington, which is the last place you're going to understand this country, that's failed in terms of what happens with López Obrador. So I can pretty much feel like López Obrador and his closest aides would all understand Washington very well, especially somebody like Ebrard. They have no idea what the rest of the US is like, and neither are they interested. And it's going into some the domestic national debate in Mexico without that can't go very far. And it goes back to the old stereotypes, those gringos, are all consumers. There's no workers there, and all they want is to extract as much wealth from us as possible, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so how do we go back to try to, Trump didn't help break the stereotype of the US. If you're a foreign reporter, I mean, if you wanted the example of the ugly American, here it was, 24 hours a day. And so he was a great step back for those of us who are doing that. But within understanding the dynamics, it's very interesting that in López Obrador's rhetoric, as well as many of his aides, the level of not understanding what the transnational communities are and the issue of immigration is astonishing. And it's not new. National politics in Mexico and national politicians have very little understanding of the immigration issue. Governors and state folks have much more. but so in the presidential debates and stuff, it's, son héroes, what's that? That was what Fox said. Why are you using that word? And basically they're either victims or people who send lots of remittances. What they think about, what they're doing, and how they're transforming the most powerful nation on earth is not on the radar in Mexico at the national political level, and that, they don't need help necessarily. It's not a paternalistic thing, which is what we're getting from the López Obrador thing, is los vamos a ayudar y los vamos a defender. And it's like, maybe some of them need to tell you how to defender and change in there. And so trying to figure out how we can cover that in another way, or to do it a deeper way, is I think what the moment demands. And where voices like Gaspar's are key for that. And so I'm buttering up the host, but,
Thank you.
But I'm waiting for the envelope later. Going back to Mexican tradition. And in terms of how I became a journalist and how somebody should become a journalist, I mean, basically it's, yes, everybody, if you're gonna, right now the technology's there so that everybody thinks they can be a journalist, and that's raises a lot of hackles among all us colleagues, is that it's not just that easy that you just, write whatever you think you how you see things, and that's good enough. To do the work and how to read, it's the worst and the best time for journalism. I think it's a moment where nobody knows the answer in terms of what the future of journalism is, in terms of working in it. At the same time, because nobody has the answers, and it means that it's a moment of reinvention for a lot of things. So I think it's exciting that way, is what is journalism now, and what shape can it take, and what happens with its relationship to power is very important right now, especially after 4 years of Trump, and some of the things that Carrie's saying about how it's used in places like Mexico and other countries, the pinche redes, las benditas redes sociales, or not only not benditas, but talk about one of the most undemocratic forms of journalism, of use, especially when it's used by people in power, Bolsonaro, Trump, etc. Not benditas, and so part of it is that I would encourage everybody to get in to help us redefine this. It's more vital than ever. You have to be able to, be able to take that torch and go into the cave and describe what you see with enough precision so that people can make decisions as to what to do with that information. Do you go into the cave? Is it safe? Is it not? Should you go to another one? And this is a very ancient profession, and so and how you tell stories is key right now, right? And the telling of stories, and that's the essence of democracy. I have the privilege of working for a very strange newspaper that was founded by journalists, and there's no millionaire behind it, and there's no owners of billionaire owners behind it, for better and for worse, because journalists are really bad at business. And so, so a for-profit operation is actually a non-profit operation usually, but there's other new initiatives taking place, like, La Jornada is not the only one, where there's the way I came into it was as a researcher, and the people would put these titles on you. When I was in Mexico, I was an expert on the US. When I'm in the US, I'm an expert on Mexico. And since I'm an expert on neither, I guess I became a journalist to find out what the hell's going on in both these countries and try to describe it as best as I can.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much for that reflection. And I want to thank both of you as we come to a close.